If I had to describe the defining quality of Gen Z, it actually wouldn't be politically radical in any sense, but it might be anxious. And I don't mean anxiety in the sense of, social anxiety or an aversion to engaging with difficult challenges, but a legitimate psychological response to a perceived loss of control, or in Gen Z's case, an actual loss of control, because we are the first generation in decades to be told to expect to be worse off than our parents were. And I think it's precisely this uncertainty that lays the groundwork for the so-called gender war we're talking about today. And by the way, I am guilty of using the word gender war, but I don't actually like it. I will come on to that. I do believe politics, or maybe I should say political causes, whether we realise they are or not, have become a tool with which men and women can grapple back control. And I suspect this is particularly the case for young women today. I think it's fair to say a majority, not all, but a majority of women instinctively seek a sense of safety and shared morals, community, emotional connection. And I think in a time of dwindling friendships, relationships, faith, family ties, what have you, modern progressivism has done a really good job of marketing itself to fill that hole. These are causes entirely bound up in the language of empathy, nurturing, and uplifting the downtrodden. I can't speak with as much certainty to young men, but I would wager that many of them seek a sense of control through community too, but perhaps one that offers a bit more structure, hierarchy, and visible purpose. And today, these traits are more readily found in conservative movements and conservative institutions. So I think we're looking at two different coping mechanisms, essentially, for solving the same problem, which is how to feel steady in a time which is anything but steady. I should caveat that by saying there have been far more turbulent times to be a young person. There was the Great Depression, 2 world wars, mass unemployment in the 70s. But none of these seem to produce what we're now tentatively referring to as the gender war. And I think what's changed the playing field so much for our generation is social media, as Elliot mentioned. The internet has essentially allowed the two genders to exist in two separate communities, which never have an obligation to converge. And what can happen is that we end up talking about each other more than we're talking to each other. And any cross-pollination that does happen tends to be the most ugly or extreme opinions on both ends. And they're held up in a kind of, oh, look at what they really think of us way. And that can obviously breed resentment over time. I don't think I need to talk about the so-called manosphere because we talk about it so much. But I do want to speak to this thing that's happening on the flip side, which is a movement of young women who are convinced and are trying to convince each other to be genuinely afraid of men in their peer group. And I don't just mean, presenting everything as a red flag or an obsession with boundaries and things like that. A poll from earlier this year actually found that 62% of women aged 18 to 24 find men in their age group pretty frightening. There was one viral TikTok video in which women were asked, would you rather find yourself alone in the woods with a man or a bear? And the majority picked the bear on the grounds that it would be less risky. Now, I don't know whether these answers were genuine or not, or whether people are just playing up to the camera. But if I was an adolescent boy coming across that video, I'd probably feel quite crap about myself either way. Ultimately, I don't think we're experiencing a war. I'm with Elliot on that. I think this is more of a mutual retreat from each other, which is reflected not only in data indicating that we're having less cross-gender relationships, platonic and romantic, but the fact that increasingly when Gen Z are asked to describe the thought of dating or even approaching the opposite sex, we're hearing words like humiliating crop up. People are really, really scared of social rejection from the opposite sex, perhaps because of how publicized the nature of dating is these days. But I think that is a really sad indication if we have actually forgotten how to interact with one another romantically without an element of suspicion being present. It does seem trivial to say that the solution might be to get outside and touch grass and actually talk to each other, but I think there's probably a lot to be said for that. There's probably a lot to be said for having some grace and compassion for the quite legitimate problems that the opposite sex faces as well. But I think, reaching understanding eye to eye rather than allowing the most extreme voices on the internet dictate how we feel about each other is the way to go. Thanks.
Thank you, and Chloe.